Fat of the Land by Wilhelmir Stephenson. Chapter 6. Living on the Fat of the Land. These are lines from an old Icelandic religious poem. There, in paradise, the feast will be set with clear wine, fat, and marrow. It is a sentiment proper to Iceland, for, by usual belief, the people of northern countries love fat meats better than sweetmeats. Actually, the quotation rests upon Mediterranean sources, for it is a translation from the Hebrew, covering the biblical passage that is rendered in English by Isaiah of the King James Version. Quote, "And in this mountain shall the Lord of hosts make unto all people a feast of fat things, a feast of wines, and of fat things full of marrow." Though it is from Palestine, this passage might well have its origins in Iceland, for the concept that fat is the best of foods has been universal with mankind in all lands and climates. When Christianity spread northward beyond the Mediterranean, the biblical phrase, "to live on the fat of the land," was readily understood in Greece, Italy, and France, in Britain, Sweden, and up among the Lapps. In English speech, fat food was called rich, which was the highest praise. The fattest was best, among men and gods, in most religions and in all countries. To the Jews, the Bible, foundation of the Christian and some other religions, is at once history and holy book. It can testify for them, a southern people, both on what they liked to eat and on what they believed concerning Jehovah. The usual family Bible of 50 years ago, the huge kind with silver clasps that was sold by the book agents, contains a Dictionary of the Bible by William Smith. Under the heading Fat, we are told, the Hebrews distinguished between the suet or pure fat of an animal and the fat which was intermixed with the lean. Nehemiah 7:10. Some parts of the suet, about the stomach, the entrails, the kidneys, and the tail of a sheep, which grows to an excessive size in many eastern countries, and produces a large quantity of rich fat, were forbidden to be eaten in the case of animals offered to Jehovah in sacrifice. The grounds of the prohibition was that the fat was the richest part of the animal, and therefore belonged to him. Most anthropologists and other students of the relation of man to his religion seem to agree that the foods considered best for sacrifice, or generally thought to be agreeable to gods and powerful spirits, are the same as those which the people themselves preferred when the religion was in its formative stage. Genesis, then, would represent, in what it says of the preferences of Jehovah, the preferences of the Hebrew people themselves when they were living in the region of Babylonia and Egypt 3,000 or 4,000 years ago. However that may be, the first reference to fat in the Bible shows both the preference of Jehovah for meat over garden produce and for fat meat over lean. It is in the 4th chapter of Genesis, from the 2nd to the 5th verse. Quote, "And Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. And in the process of time it came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering unto the Lord. And Abel he also brought of the firstlings of his flock, and of the fat thereof. And the Lord had respect unto Abel, and to his offering, but unto Cain, and to his offering he had not respect." In Genesis 49:20 we have, quote, "Out of Asher his bread shall be fat, and he shall yield royal dainties." In Nehemiah 8, quote, "Then he said unto them, Go your way, eat the fat, and drink the sweet." The passage which has made "to live on the fat of the land" a part of our common speech, with a clear and familiar meaning to the least erudite, is found in Genesis 45:17-18. "And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, Take your father and your households, and come unto me, and I will give you the good of the land of Egypt, and ye shall eat the fat of the land." As I was mulling this over, two things occurred to me: that I was not sure what kind of fat the biblical writer had in mind, perhaps olive oil, and that I had recently met a man whom I had long admired, the famous biblical scholar Edgar Johnson Goodspeed, author of many learned works and known to a wide public as editor and translator of The Complete Bible, an American translation, published by the University of Chicago Press. So I wrote Dr. Goodspeed. He replied December 12, 1936, quote, I have a frightful feeling that your letter of some time ago has been neglected, and if so, I am exceedingly sorry. The fact is, I handed it at once to some of our Old Testament experts for their concurrent judgment on the point, and did not get it back for a good while. Anyway, if it is not too late, let me say that I have talked to 4 or 5 of them yesterday, and we agree that the fundamental figure, the figure at the bottom of the expression, the fat of the land, is an animal one. The idea that the fat is the best part of the beast, the part to be offered in sacrifice, and all that. Animal tissue, meat, was of course a rarity with the biblical people. They did not have it every day. It was a delicacy, and the fat was the greatest delicacy of all, it seems. Of course, the figure was meant to suggest more than animal fat, the wheat and oil and so on, but the fundamental idea was the animal. End quote. As with the subtropical Jews, so it was with the Greeks just northwest of them, beyond the Mediterranean. They too liked their meat fat, and believed that their demigods and heroes preferred it so. Like most ancient peoples, they seldom praised foods and drinks other than fat meat and sweet wine. I have gone over the Iliad done into English prose by Andrew Lang, Walter Leaf, and Ernest Myers, and have found a number of things that bear on this study. There was, for instance, the case of Agamemnon, king of men, who slew a fat bull of 5 years to most mighty Cronion. That was in the 2nd book of the Iliad. In Book 9, Patroclus hearkened to his dear comrade Achilles. He cast down a great fleshing block in the firelight, and laid thereon a sheep's back, and a fat goat's, and a great hog's chine, rich with fat. In Book 8 is the speech of Sarpedon. Verily our kings that rule Lycia be no inglorious men, they that eat fat sheep, and drink the choice wine honey sweet. And so with the literature of the rest of Europe, as one goes north in the time before the coming of sugar, when few except the queens were able to sit in the kitchen, eating honey with their bread. These ancient and medieval writings show no marked northward increase or decrease in the praise of rich foods until the investigator comes to Iceland, that lies in the sea hard by the Arctic Circle, and meets with a proverb, Fleira matur in feit kjot, meaning that fat meat is not the only decent food, a saying which mothers no doubt used for encouraging children to eat lean meat, porridge, and bread that did not have quite enough butter on it. Incidentally, the taste of the British of the present time does not vary, it seems, from that of the Old Testament Hebrews. They like mutton, lean or fat, or so we are told in a dispatch from Joseph Barnes, foreign editor of the New York Herald Tribune, which was published by that newspaper May 30, 1944, with a London dateline, and under the heading, Britain Looks to the Future. The opening sentence reads, Saddles of mutton with mint sauce and boiled silver sides with dumplings are reported to play a large part in the dreams of Britishers these nights, as the promised liberation of the continent hangs heavy over their sleep. That the British prefer their mutton fat is certified by their prose writers, among them Dickens, and by their poets, among them Thomas Love Peacock, who was beyond doubt in harmony with the national taste when he wrote, The mountain sheep are sweeter, but the valley sheep are fatter. We therefore deem it meeter to carry off the latter. As shall be shown in subsequent pages, one longs for fat intensely if there is too little of it, and is promptly satiated when he has had enough. However, really intense fat hunger occurs only when one is unable to secure fat's approximate dietetic equivalents, the starches and sugars. Accordingly, little is heard of fat hunger except from people who are unable to substitute these equivalents for the olive oil, seal oil, cream, bacon, or butter to which they are accustomed. So there are few signs of fat hunger in the records of grain-fed Egypt, although they are not absent. Neither is there much of this in the records of ancient China. Still, the learned Dr. Hu Shi, recent ambassador from China to the United States, tells me that in the fragments of knowledge which still exist about the most remote Chinese religions, there are indications that the people were extremely fond of meats, and particularly of fat meats. In that religion, as in others, there is the implication or assertion that the gods, demigods, and ancient heroes had an abundance of fat on their tables. It is easy to see in the literature and history of Western Europe during the last few centuries how the dominance of fat as a luxury and a delicacy has gradually waned, in step with the increased use of sugar. Shakespeare has many references to good food as rich, and of course with the intent that rich means fat. It would have been a compliment for him to say that the cooking in a boarding house was greasy. Indeed, this does not appear to have been a derogatory remark until within the last 100 years, which are the years during which sugar has risen from a negligible to an actually commanding position. It is difficult, at least for me, to discover figures that seem reliable for sugar's creeping into the economy and dietary of European nations, but it is clear that 200 years ago sugar was as yet negligible. It remained until long after that a compliment to say that food was rich, and the history of the language makes it clear that sweetness is a more recent connotation of that word than fatness. Indeed, we seldom, even now, call a thing rich just because it is sweet. It has to be fat as well. This is not a study of the increase of sugar consumption, except incidentally. Concern is with the decrease in the popularity of fat. It is barely possible that there is no causal relation, but it seems clear that as one of these foods increased in popularity, the other declined. Soldiers, at least those of the United States, are great hands at complaining about food, although it is said that there was less of this formerly, that the real epoch of bellyaching about the grub started with the Spanish-American War, and was at its highest point in World War I. However that may be, there was complaining about food even in the Revolutionary War, a good deal of it, for instance, at Valley Forge. But a friend who lives in the Valley Forge neighborhood, and has studied the history and local tradition, tells me that the distressing winter spent there by the Continental Army brought forth no complaint on the score of sugar, yet they had little or none. It seems that Washington's contemporaries looked upon sugar not as a food, but as a condiment, and one of which they were not sufficiently fond to deplore its absence. In connection with a historical study made for the office of the Quartermaster General, trying to determine why there has sprung up in the Army a prejudice against pemmican, a rich food highly favored by previous generations, I appealed for help to the Department of Commerce, trying to determine how likely it appeared that the declining popularity of fat was due to the growing ascendancy of sugar in the national diet. From them, from the American Meat Institute of Chicago, and from the Sugar Research Foundation of New York, I received figures of per capita annual sugar consumption from 1791 to 1941. Sugar consumption in the United States, year pounds per capita. 1791, 7.5 pounds. 1800, 8 pounds. 1820, 8.3 pounds. 1840, 14 pounds. 1860, 30.5 pounds. 1880, 42.7 pounds. 1900, 65.2 pounds. 1920, 86.5 pounds. 1940, 97.2 pounds. That is how the table goes, by 20-year periods. There was a rise in 1941 to 114 pounds per capita, after which there are no, quote, normal figures. Thereafter they are affected by rationing. It seems that the entire sugar consumption of the United States is not represented in the table, and that the actual is somewhat greater. At least that is what may be gathered from a study entitled Summary of Estimated Per Capita Consumption of Foodstuffs in the United States since 1880 by C. Roy Mundy, Chief of the Bureau of Foreign and Domestic Commerce, These figures are given for the period 1927 to 1931. Sugar, 102 pounds. Candy, 12 pounds. Corn sugar, 7 pounds. Corn syrup unmixed, 6.3 pounds. Mixtures of corn and other syrups, 1.8 pounds. Total, 129.6 pounds. Now, the average sugar consumption of the years 1927 to 1931 is given in the separate sugar table furnished by the Department of Commerce as 102.26 pounds per capita, essentially the same as the 102.24 found in the Mundy study for sugar alone, which shows that the department does not tabulate candy, corn sugar, and corn syrups as sugar, although they would be so recognized by the digestive functions. Nor does honey appear to be a sugar in the statistics. And they do not, of course, reckon with the sugar content of fruits that are eaten. Following up the same inquiry, I wrote the librarian of the Army War College, Colonel A. Gibson, saying that I had heard that there was neither sugar nor complaint of its lack at Valley Forge, and wanted to know about this food in the dietetic history of the Army. Colonel Gibson replied on June 8, 1944, quote, "The following is copied from an article prepared in the office of the Quartermaster General and published in the Quartermaster Review for September through October 1931, pages 9 through 21. Quote, "Sugar, once a luxury in the Army, now occupies a most important place among the components of the ration. In the Revolutionary War, before its value as an article of food was recognized, and when it was considered a luxury by both soldier and civilian alike, sugar formed no part of the ration of the Continental soldier. In fact, it was not until 1838 that sugar made its first appearance on the authorized rations of the soldiers, and we find in tables issued that at that time a daily allowance of 1.62 ounces of sugar per man. This allowance was maintained without change until the outbreak of the Civil War in 1860, at which time it was increased to 2.4 ounces per day. The next increase came with the Spanish-American War in 1898, at which time the daily allowance for a soldier was increased to 3.2 ounces. This allowance was maintained at practically the same level until the outbreak of the World War in 1917, when it was increased for troops serving in the war zone to 4 ounces a day per man, and in addition each soldier was allowed 1/2 pound of candy every 10 days. Troops at home during this period, however, were allowed no increase in sugar, but received the 3.2 ounces per day authorized in 1898, and no allowance of candy. Shortly after the World War, the sugar ration was increased for all troops, regardless of the place they were serving, to 4 ounces a day, at the level where it now stands. In addition, many other components containing sugar have been added to the ration. The sugar ration of World War II remained as in World War I. It is a usual assumption that the increase of sugar in the diet has been paralleled by a decrease in the use of fats, and this is probably true. Still, it is possible that what has actually taken place is not so much a decrease in the popularity of fats as a decrease in the attractiveness of certain words used for fats, among them the terms fat, grease, tallow. The same person who tells you he dislikes fat may add that he is very fond of butter, cream, or bacon. The man who tells you he dislikes beef fat may be fond of beef gravy and of suet pudding. In fact, many find that the expression rendered beef suet does not have a disagreeable connotation, but that beef tallow does, yet the two expressions are synonymous. The word blubber, though you may have never tasted blubber or spoken with anyone who has, will likely give you a feeling of revulsion. In these reflections there is one more answer to the Shakespearean, "What's in a name?" My own description of the taste of the fresh blubber of the bowhead whale, and of other whales with which I am familiar, is that it reminds of fresh cow's cream with a barely perceptible suggestion of walnut flavor. When Dr. Elisha Kent Kane, famous polar explorer and aristocrat of the Pennsylvania Canes, discovered that seal and whale blubber tasted delicious, he was probably right when he protested, "Oh, call it not blubber." He felt that the trouble was not with the thing itself, but with the name, which somehow had acquired a bad connotation. It has been suggested that the repulsive connotation of blubber is not from the sound or other intrinsic quality of this element of speech, but must be derived from the experience of people who found blubber disagreeable. The argument runs that blubber turns rancid easily, and that in the great days of the whale fishery, when animal oil was used in the lamps of Europe and America, people in London and New York occasionally tasted the blubber that was landed from the whaling ships and found it disagreeable. Hence the present connotation of the word. Except that there is proverbially no use arguing about taste, it might be called illogical to have a revulsion against fresh blubber just because it gets rancid easily and then does not taste or smell good. For people do not feel disgust at the names of cream and butter just because cream goes sour easily when it is not pasteurized and butter becomes rancid when it is not salted. Then, as to the disagreeable smell of rancid blubber, it is common experience that things do not necessarily taste bad, although they smell bad, as with cheeses. Or perhaps it is rather that things which smell bad to those not used to them do not necessarily smell bad to those who like them. Perfectly fresh cheeses taste good, except perhaps a little flat. Cheeses that stink, in the opinion of the novice, may be the delight of the connoisseur. So it is with cream. There are large sections of America, and smaller ones of Europe, where cream is preferred fresh, and both the smell and taste of sour cream are disliked. But there are also large sections of Europe, and smaller ones in America, where people relish the smell and taste of sour cream, and prefer it to the fresh. The like is true of the fresh blubber of the seal and the whale. Those used to it, and most novices who try it, think it tastes good, and find it nearly or quite odorless. To the connoisseur, fresh blubber corresponds in taste to cottage cheese. Good enough, but rather insipid. To him, the fermented blubber, or oil, is what camembert or limburger are to our gourmets. The man who makes the same effort to get to like strong blubber that we make in getting to like strong cheese will both acquire the taste and come to the conclusion that the correct descriptive word is fermented, not rancid, for involved in the process is an acid reaction, so that, if one likes oil that has been in a skin bag through a long and hot summer, he will describe it as tasting and smelling something like French dressing. Perhaps a description of the smell might be that it suggests a blend of soft camembert and vinegar. But what is the use of arguing, unless perhaps with the gourmet? If I were trying to introduce fermented blubber to the dinner tables of New York, I would begin with the connoisseurs of Chinese eggs and English game. Even then, I would change the name. With Cain, I would say, "Oh, call it not blubber." That it may be the name, but not fat itself, which has lost popularity, is suggested by a special memorandum of June 14, 1944, made up for me by Charles E. Lund, acting chief of the Foodstuffs Unit of the Department of Commerce. Quote, "There is no decreased consumption of edible fats, both total and per capita. It has been rising throughout the years and in England. It is not believed that there is any correlation in the use of the fat and protein group with the carbohydrate products like sugar, except that as incomes diminish, people fill up on the cheaper carbohydrates, such as grain products." So in other words, carbohydrates are for poor people. The per capita use of edible fats has shown an upward trend from the first definite record in 1912 of United States consumption. The statement is, then, that fat consumption has increased in the last 3 decades, during which period the use of sugar rose from around 80 pounds per year to around 100 pounds. This would not say that no decrease occurred during the previous century, while sugar was rising from 8 pounds to 80 pounds per year. By 1931, the per capita fat consumption was 47.2 pounds, and in the last full pre-war year, 1940, it had risen to 50 pounds. These figures are for commercially known edible fats: lard, butter, shortening, margarine, and cooking and salad oils. They consider butter on a 100% basis, although the fat content is actually 81%. There has also been increasing use of so-called invisible fats in this country. It is estimated that in 1939, the per capita consumption of edible fats in the United States was 95 pounds, of which 46 pounds came from prepared products, and 49 pounds from, quote, invisible fats, including bacon, meat, fish, cheese, milk, ice cream, eggs, cereals, nuts, cocoa, and mayonnaise. In 1943, although some of our fat and oil supplies had been rationed, total per capita consumption had risen to 102 pounds, with 45 pounds from visible fats. A study seeking to establish a correlation between sugar and fat consumption for any sizable portion of the human race over a period of years would constitute a research project of considerable dimensions. We have no reference to any such study. The point made by Dr. Lund in his first paragraph is, of course, of paramount importance, that people with small incomes, and those who are trying to save money irrespective of income, will buy the cheaper foods. Starches and sugars are cheaper than the fats. As this is written, the prices in a certain neighborhood store are, by the pound, butter 50 cents, bacon 38 cents, lard 20 cents, sugar 7 cents, flour 6 cents. Even with fat a little more than twice as nourishing as sugar or starch, which many people do not know, there is a strong pocketbook motive for working off on tenants, or even the family, dishes in which cereals and sugar play the leading role. Dr. Lund suggests that the hidden fats are being consumed in growing quantities. That has a pocketbook motive too, for they average cheaper than the other fats. In this study, the significant thing is that people like what they are used to. It may have been poverty, or a desire to set money aside for a rainy day, that induced one's parents to feed them so largely on bread, potatoes, porridge, cake, jam, syrup, and sugar. But that is what he has grown up on, and he is the victim, or the beneficiary, of established food habits according to which he likes these cheap things because he is used to them. Not only that, he has a strong emotional bias in their favor, as, in his opinion, proper food, good food, American food. Lest any reader think that I believe I am presenting here something new in dietetics, I mention that I have myself argued at some length, in at least 3 books, that one likes eating what he is used to eating. Nor did I, as the presentation shows, think this a new doctrine in 1913, when the first of these books was published. Most writers, including me, present the view not as special to dietetics, but as a general principle, a law of taste applicable to climate, landscape, music, deportment, pretty well everything. As this is being written, the Associated Press carries under a Washington dateline a news story summarizing the findings of the Committee on Food Habits of the National Research Council. They have come to the usual conclusion, which, however, they state in an unusual phrase. Instead of repeating the hackneyed, "You like to eat what you are used to eating," they say, "People like what they eat rather than eat what they like." I quote from the Christian Science Monitor of September 25, 1944. The committee sent investigators into selected areas to ask the folks what they ate and why they relished those particular victuals. Interviews with selected housewives representing varied income brackets in a Midwestern city disclosed that meat tends to be less frequently mentioned as a favorite dish with decreasing income level. Vegetable dishes showed an opposite trend and were mentioned significantly more often by the low-income groups. This may be interpreted as supporting the hypothesis that people like what they eat rather than eat what they like. A committee bulletin concluded. The reporter adds that the discovery is considered of vast importance in long-range plans for upgrading American diet. While cheapness may create a liking for an article of food through the establishment of a habit that derives from economy, there is also another and reverse tendency to favor a thing because it is costly, presenting the full application of Thorstein Veblen's doctrine of conspicuous waste. We all know people who serve strawberries in January more frequently than in May and June, even though it is a common experience that berries imported from afar, as out-of-season luxuries, are seldom of as good flavor as the neighborhood product is when in season. Here the desire to show off triumphs over the combined motives of economy and flavor. People who do things of this kind will rationalize if put on the defensive. They will tell you that they belong to the "I want what I want when I want it" school, that they can afford it, and that tradesmen would not get along so very well if men of means like themselves did not put money into circulation. Such defense arguments may or may not be sound, but at any rate there are those who eat caviar and truffles partly because they cost a lot. Still, this factor that tends to produce taste for costly things is of small power compared with the strength of food habits that are established in childhood and adolescence through the force of economy motives in home, boarding house, and boarding school. Fat, the word is now under nearly as strong a taboo complex of feelings as blubber. Our average citizen does not eat if he can help it. This means he does not eat the things which he calls fat. He does not eat tallow under that name, almost as reprehensible as fat. But he loves beef gravy, which may contain a large amount of tallow. He trims the fat off his steak and leaves it behind on the plate, not wholly or mainly, as Verblin might have diagnosed it, in order to distinguish himself by conspicuous wastefulness. Rather he does it because this part of the steak comes under the taboo name of fat, for which reason he has avoided it from childhood, has scarcely ever tasted it, and is sure he does not like it. Meantime he eats a lot of fat under its agreeable names of cream, butter, bacon, gravy, shortening, salad dressing. He eats tallow not merely as beef gravy, but in several other ways, for instance as suet in suet pudding. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who make journeys where lightness, compactness, and convenience are important, formerly used canned lard. As this is written, December 1944, comes word that on the north coast of Canada, lard and also butter to some extent have been replaced on police sledge journeys by beef tallow and rectangular bricks. Still, in spite of all the taboos, there is a widespread understanding that fat hunger is not only possible but normal. At one stage of World War II, we were trying to talk ourselves into various beliefs about the weakness of Germany. Then it was frequently alleged that Nazis were suffering from fat hunger, which condition would help in bringing them to their knees. Later we heard about fat hunger in occupied countries, from Norway south, and not least in the Balkans and Greece. To this degree, at least, and in spite of the common belief that fat is more necessary in cold than in warm weather, we realize generally that fat is desirable, whatever the climate. Some chapters back, in the account of the year on exclusive meat in New York, I mentioned that, although Anderson and I ate more of both fat and lean during cold than warm weather, still the proportion of fat to lean remained constant, if we were able to choose our food at each meal according to taste, with nothing to choose between but lean and fat. Except as tastes are controlled by propaganda and fashion, the longing for fat, summer or winter, depends on what else one eats. If his is an exclusive meat diet, then he simply must have fat with his lean. Otherwise he would sicken and die. On a mixed diet, since fats, sugars, and starches are in most practical respects dietetically equivalent, he eats more of any one of them if the combined amount of the other two is decreased. It has been considered strange by some, but really is not strange if one knows the local conditions, that extravagant praise of fat occurs neither in the usual conversation nor in the folk tales of Eskimos. The animals they hunt are usually so fat that when they have secured all the lean meat they need, they have on hand more fat than they can use. So when they have eaten all they want, there is enough fat left over for fuel and light. And, as I keep saying in this book, it makes no difference how fond one is of fat. He is bound to turn against it as soon as he has had all that is good for him. Of all foods, fat is preeminently the one where enough is enough. Among hunting people, the chances of fat hunger increase toward the equator, for the animals on which they depend are more and more skinny, the farther south they go, until in places like tropical Africa there are only a few species that accumulate fat, chiefly the hippo and the eland. Quite naturally, therefore, we get from Central Africa and northern Australia the most extreme stories of fat hunger. Two of the most reliable and competent authorities on the tropics whom I have known personally are Akeley on Africa and Wilkins on Australia. In the 4th chapter of this book, I have referred to what Akeley used to tell of African fat hunger when we were housemates in New York. Sir Hubert Wilkins, when he and I were in the Arctic together, both living at times exclusively on meat, gave me what remains my best single instance of how fats were crowded out. Sir Hubert's father, the first white child born in South Australia, told that when he was born, around 1840, the herdsmen, who were the majority of the population, lived almost exclusively on mutton, sometimes on beef, and on tea. At all times of year they killed the fattest sheep for their own use, and when in the open, which was frequently, they roasted the fattest parts against a fire with a dripping pan underneath, later dipping the meat into the drippings as they ate. Then gradually commerce developed. Breads and pastries began to be used, jams and jellies were imported or manufactured, and, with the advance of starches and sugars, the use of fat mutton and fat beef decreased. Now, except that the Australians eat rather more meat per year than people do in the British Isles, the proportion of fat to the rest of the diet is probably about the same in Australia as elsewhere within the British Commonwealth of Nations. Sir Hubert is usually thought of as an Antarctic and Arctic explorer, which is right, but he is also distinguished for his tropical research through the 2-year expedition he conducted for the British Museum in Northern Australia, as told in his book, Undiscovered Australia, London, 1928. The Swedish explorer Karl Lumholtz was in tropical Australia long before Wilkins, and reported that the natives ate their meals on the principle children apply when they raid a cupboard. They used up the best things first, and did not eat anything but meat whenever they had enough meat, and the fatter the meat the better. This Wilkins confirmed, and added certain observations along the same line. Wilkins found that the missionaries were having some trouble in breaking the natives of cannibalism, and that the difficulty was serious in proportion to the fatness of the deceased. When an emaciated man died, little was needed beyond a stern admonition, but when a corpulent man was buried, they had to stand watch over the grave, and corpses sometimes disappeared weeks and months after burial. Seemingly the natives liked their cadavers high, as the English like their game, and the Norwegians their cheese, or at least did not mind them getting that way, if they were fat enough. Background for the tropical fat hunger that drove the Wilkins cannibals of northern Australia to the exhumation of their corpulent dead comes from a particularly tropical section of Western Africa, through a letter written by a medical missionary, Dr. G. W. Harley, who has been in Liberia most of the time since 1926, when he founded there the Ganta mission of the Methodist Church, of which he is still superintendent. For his qualifications as a witness, in addition to a residence of 18 years, I looked him up in American Men of Science. From that and other sources it appears that he was born in North Carolina, graduated from Duke University, received his medical degree at Yale, has studied in the Harvard Graduate School, is Phi Beta Kappa, and has degrees A.B., M.D., Ph.D. His experience is not wholly tropical, for in 1924 he served at the Harrington Hospital of the Grenfell Mission in Labrador. He has been a research associate in the Peabody Museum of Harvard since 1932. He has published numerous medical and geographical articles, is at work on a book about the Negro culture of Liberia for the Peabody Museum, and is author of Native African Medicine, published by the Harvard University Press, 1934. A good deal less than such a record would have created a presumption of competence as a witness for Dr. Harley, who writes from the Peabody Museum, August 31, 1944, in part, quote, "Meat hunger is striking and constant among the tribes I have contacted. While meat of any kind is in great demand, it is interesting to note that the following are their favorite cuts. Number 1. Brisket of beef with the fat and cartilages. 2. The skin and subcutaneous fat of a warthog. Pigskin is never saved for rawhide and leather. It is too valuable as food, and is eaten after singeing off the hair, and prolonged boiling. Plump cowskin is similarly eaten. A lean cowskin will be saved for rawhide and leather. 3. The hog's head, brains, and fat are both delicacies. 4. The liver of any animal. 5. The hands and feet of monkey because of the fat content. Wild meat in Liberia is seldom fat. Even the fat of warthogs is mostly subcutaneous. Antelope are lean all the way through. Even domestic cattle are lean. Consequently, it is interesting to note that certain animals which normally store more fat than others are preferred for that reason. 1. The giant rat, called possum. 2. The domestic dog, fattened by the Capelli people especially for eating. 3. The cow that has turned out to be sterile, and so has never suckled the calf, but grown fat instead. 4. Porcupines. 5. Warthogs. 6. Snakes, such as python, Bitis gabonica, and mamba. 7. A leopard in its prime, plump and fat. 8. A snakefish, very fat. My own experience for 20 years has been that of a person very active physically, consuming meat whenever available in amounts comparable to that eaten in temperate climates. It was not unusual for us to put up a whole hog in tin cans for our personal use. Moreover, when meat was not available for making gravy, we had a gravy made of palm oil, flavored with meat stock or bouillon cubes. We had gravy 3 times a day and 365 days in the year. We also used all the milk, eggs, and butter we could get, and the 4 of us consumed between 1 and 2 pounds of peanut butter a week. We had fresh vegetables every day from our own garden, whatever the season, but it was for meat and butter that we often felt hungry. On returning to the United States, I arrived during a heat wave and hungrily devoured fat pork and country sausages in Washington, D.C., was disappointed when I could not get sausages with pancakes in Boston because it was too hot for sausages. In the tropics, the men who last longest and are happiest are the ones who either get some exercise, golf, tennis, hunting, and fishing, or actually do a reasonable amount of physical work. If they work, they must eat. Calorie requirements are relatively high because the millions of sweat glands are working overtime, and the skin could be termed the largest single organ of the body. Men who work in hot places do not avoid meat and fats, but rather the opposite." End quote. Such are the views of a doctor of medicine with long experience of the humid tropics. From him, turn to George H. Siebold, distinguished for success in the tropics as businessman rather than scientist. He spent 6 years in the Philippines as a school teacher, more than a decade in Sumatra representing the United States Rubber Company, and then 6 years in Liberia for the Firestone interests. He came to believe, and to act on the belief, that much of the so-called enervating effect of the tropical climate is due to faulty nutrition. In the case of white men, he believes the enervation traceable to faulty theories of diet that physicians and others bring with them from the temperate zone, particularly the theory that you should go light on meat in hot weather, and that if you do eat meat, it should be lean. Mrs. Siebold believes in varying meals a good deal, but allows her husband considerable fat meat. When she is away from home, he has only 2 meals a day, noon and evening. At both, he eats pork chops 2 inches thick, with at least 3/4 of an inch of fat all the way around the outer edge of each. During one absence of his wife, every meal he ate for 6 weeks consisted of these chops. In the United States, Mr. Siebold has great trouble getting food he likes at restaurants. The pork chops they serve are not thick enough, and they trim the fat from them before cooking. During the New York year of exclusive meat described in a previous chapter, My impression was that we endured the heat of the city and the neighborhood, which in summer can be uncomfortable to most New Yorkers, somewhat better than did the average of our fellows. We were frequent victims of the commiseration of friends who knew that meat is bad for people in hot weather, that fat is good food in winter and bad in summer, things of that sort. We rather took pleasure in undeceiving our friends, doubtless parading more than was called for our relative comfort in the heat. Another situation was embarrassing. One of the most famous members of the Who's Who medical committee that supervised our test was Dr. Graham Lusk, a distinguished physiologist, part of whose distinction rested on work he had done to show that body temperatures might be controlled to advantage in summer by the food one ate. According to him, a person could be relatively comfortable if he ate things like fruits and green vegetables. What had to be avoided, particularly, was meat. Here we were, with the summer heat coming on, forced to live wholly on meat. At first Dr. Lusk showed, as we understood it, kindness and commiseration. He was worried about us, and was trying to hearten us. The summer might not be so hot. We were going to have a cottage up near Croton, and could lie around in the shade of the trees, avoiding exertion. On the whole, he felt that we would get through all right. But when a spell of hot weather came early in the season, while we were still in the city, and when we assured Dr. Lusk we were not feeling it particularly, we had the impression that he was at first puzzled, and later wistful in his questions, hoping he could elicit from us some confirmation of his theory that meat was a food which made people feel specially uncomfortable on a hot day. We had also the feeling that, in spite of being sponsor of the theory, Dr. Lusk was more open-minded about it than our lay friends. I think he considered we were giving him evidence which was difficult to reconcile with this theory. I am afraid that many of our other friends thought that we were just putting it on, that we were so wedded to our eccentric food notions that we simply would not own up to how wretched we felt in the heat. Some of these friends, especially those who did not see us frequently, are still telling about our awful time that we had that summer, what with the extreme warm spells and our heat-producing diet. Shortly after the close of the New York year on meat, an old friend, Earl Parker Hanson, who had already spent 4 years in subtropical Chile, left for a 2-year survey of the Orinoco and Amazon basins for the Carnegie Institution. As he tells it now, he still had then the usual North American beliefs about South American food habits, to the effect that the local people were pretty well all wrong, and that North American knowledge of dietetics enabled us to devise regimens better suited to the humid tropics than what the people of those tropics were eating and liked to eat. When he was gradually converted away from this view, he also began to learn, through what eventually became a wide reading of Amazon literature, that others before him had arrived there at the same conclusions by similar steps, but of course without influencing the prevailing dietetic theories of North America and Europe, which, in the main, are deduced from animal experimentation and from chemical facts, the matter of their applicability to humans being rather easily taken for granted. There was, for instance, Henry Wallace Bates, contemporary and friend of Darwin, who spent about 11 years living in and traveling all over the Amazon basin. His book, A Naturalist on the River Amazon, is one of the great classics of tropical exploration. It is now available in every man's library, in which edition he says on page 106, quote, "I had found out by this time that animal food was as much a necessary of life in this exhausting climate as it is in the north of Europe. An attempt which I made to live on vegetable food was quite a failure." As is told more fully in the chapter Second Pemmican War, there was in Washington in the spring of 1943 a controversy within the Army as to whether pemmican should be used as a military ration or as an element in one. The chief argument against its use, except for the allegation that soldiers would not like it, was that, because of a high fat content, it was not an all-climate ration, but one useful only in cold weather, thus good only half the year in the temperate zone, and no good at all in the tropics. At this stage, Hansen was one of the tropical advisors of the Quartermaster General, though later he went to Africa in charge of a mission to study Liberia for the Foreign Economic Administration. From his own experience of the humid tropics, from the verbal reports of fellow reporters whom he met in the Explorers Club of New York and elsewhere, and from his reading of tropical literature, he was convinced that the high fat content of pemmican was no argument against its use in hot weather. He felt that if it was a good food in the Arctic, it would be equally good in the tropics. So he decided to try it out through a part of the Washington summer, where the maximum temperatures of June, July, and August are demonstrably higher and, in Hansen's opinion, more discomforting than, for instance, at Manaus on the Amazon. For Hansen's account of the Amazon and Orinoco country, climate, and people, see his Journey to Manaus, 1938. He has been so kind as to give me a statement, dated February 15, 1944. It deals with pemmican and was intended by him for use in one of this book's pemmican chapters, but his facts and views seem even more pertinent to the question of fat as an element in a hot weather diet, so I am using his letter here. Quote, "My experiences with pemmican grew out of the personal conviction that meat, including the proper amount of fat, is every bit as necessary for health and energy in the tropics as in the north. I have long wondered about the glaring discrepancies in the nutritionists' arguments to the contrary. On the one hand, they say that fat is the most efficient energy food known. On the other, they talk in doleful tones about the debilitating effects of the tropic climate. Why you should be careful to avoid energy-giving foods in a climate that supposedly saps your energy has always been beyond me. The pygmies of the tropical Ituri forest will run miles to gorge themselves on the fat of a recently killed hippopotamus. That sort of evidence from natives in various parts of the tropics, both humid and dry, you have in plenty. So I confine myself to giving my own experiences and stating my own conclusions. My personal experience with fat shortage came on my Orinoco Amazon expedition of 1931 to 1933, when my canoe Indians practically went on strike because I hadn't included sufficient lard or other fat in my supplies. Almost every newcomer to the Orinoco runs into that situation. His Indians make sure, before starting a journey, that he has with him plenty of fats. I bought enough fat to please my Indians and then proceeded to eat on the journey from a separate pot, because I couldn't stand their greasy food. It wasn't many weeks, however, before I avidly grabbed at every turtle egg I could get a hold of, for its rich oil, as I now realize, and at every Brazil nut, avocado pear, and every other source of vegetable fat, when I couldn't get animal fats. In those days I did not correlate that craving with my food tastes and habits. Now I do. If today I were to go on another extended journey through the Amazon basin, I would either take pemmican with me from the United States, or spend some time, first of all, making it down in Brazil. Recently a lady ethnologist told me that I was all wrong in my claim that any healthy white man can stay in perfect health, as far as food alone is concerned, on any diet that keeps native populations and primitive peoples in health. She said she had tried it for a number of weeks in Mexico with almost disastrous results. But when I asked her if she hadn't had trouble adjusting her taste to the greasy food of the Mexicans, she stipulated that, of course, she and her companions, while eating exactly what the Mexicans had ate, had taken pains to prepare the food in an appetizing way by leaving out the grease. Then she went on to describe her own subsequent troubles in the typical terms of fat shortage: constant hunger, a vague discomfort, lack of energy, distended stomach, etc. With such convictions to start with, growing out of years of personal experience in the tropics, I went on a pemmican regimen in the summer of 1943, staying on it for 9 weeks. I was leading a sedentary life of office work, and it was one of the hottest summers on record in New York and Washington, with temperatures that went higher on a number of occasions than I have ever experienced them in the Amazon basin. In the beginning, I took sugarless tea with my pemmican, but later I saw no sense in brewing tea and simply drank water. There were 6 occasions on which I didn't have pemmican with me and ate something else. On all of those, I simply ate fresh fat meat, which is dietetically the same as pemmican. Some of the results of the test are listed below. Vitamins. When I first started, you warned me that the kind of pemmican I was using had been overcooked. Footnote. In the pemmican used by Mr. Hansen, the lean meat had been cooked before drying, as against the Indian method of drying it uncooked. Then, as Mr. Hansen tells us, he used to cook his pemmican again before eating it, so that it was by then twice cooked. When I first started, you warned me that the kind of pemmican I was using had been overcooked, and was therefore probably deficient in vitamin C, with the danger that it might, for reasons of faulty preparation, and not because it was all meat, result in scurvy. So you advised me to add vitamin pills to my diet. Foolishly, I replied that I wasn't afraid of scurvy, knowing how to cure it, and that it would be interesting to find out whether this type of pemmican would bring it on, how long that would take, what the disease would be like in its early stages, and how quickly it could be cured. I still think my reasoning was right, except that I hadn't counted on the nutritionists. When I did develop the preclinical symptoms of scurvy, after a little more than 4 weeks, the nutritionists took it to mean that pemmican is no good. For a week at this stage, I did have a rather difficult time with the diet, but I added vitamin pills as well as a number of lemons, which have practically no food value outside of their antiscorbutic properties. Antiscorbutic is a fancy word for anti-scurvy. I got back on an even keel and stayed on pemmican for something like 5 weeks longer, using pharmaceutical vitamin preparations as the only supplement to the exclusive pemmican. In any event, that experience with vitamin shortage has nothing to do with the suitability of fat meat in the tropics, where plenty of antiscorbutic animal and vegetable foods are available. Fat content. The dietitians warned me when I started that I was endangering my health because they knew from years of research that a fat content of more calories than about 35% in the diet is dangerous. I believe this may be correct for a mixed diet, but know it to be absolutely incorrect for an all-meat diet. My pemmican was one of 3 types. Type A was so designed that 80% of the calories came from the fat and 20% from the lean, meaning a ratio of about 50-50 by weight. Type B had 70% of the calories in the fat and 30% in the lean. Type C had 60% of the calories in the fat and 40% in the lean. At first, I preferred the lean, type C pemmican, because I wasn't used to eating much fat. It wasn't long, however, before I began to realize it was unsuitable. I tried the other kinds and found that where 1/4 of a pound per day of the fat pemmican, type A, was absolutely satisfying, I would eat well over 1 pound per day of the lean pemmican, type C, and still feel hungry, with a craving for fat. In one period of a few days, when I had nothing on hand but type C, I added bacon grease and roast beef drippings to this pemmican, and so got along very well. After 16 days, some of the nutritionists got hold of me, showed me figures provided by the National Research Council to the effect that man can't assimilate more than 35% of fat in his diet, and so proved to me that I was either dead or coasting along on my last reserves of energy. It was a gorgeous battle, especially in view of the fact that I had more pep for such purposes as arguing with nutritionists than I remembered ever having had before. I was in the very pink of condition, with all the minor difficulties of the first, mainly psychological, adjustment to an all-meat diet behind me. I finally gave up such fruitless argument, however, when the nutritionists asked me in despair whether I didn't even believe the National Research Council. The important thing is that during the entire 9 weeks, in very hot weather, my appetites and cravings constantly demanded a high fat content of around 75 to 80% by calories. That was to me one of the most striking results of my experiences. Being highly concentrated, pemmican is tricky stuff, resulting in almost immediate cravings to warn of shortcomings, whereas less concentrated foods seemed to take much longer to give warning signals. In the beginning, it took only an hour or so after eating the lean pemmican before I knew from the way I felt that I had far too little fat. In the beginning, it took only an hour or so after eating the lean pemmican before I knew from the way I felt that I had had too little fat. Later, after I had learned to trust to my own appetites and reactions, that adjustment was automatic. Quantities taken. I had learned from you, this is Earl Parker Hansen speaking to Vilhelmir Stephenson still in his letter. So when he says you, he means Stephenson. I had learned from you that when a man considerably overeats of fat, in hot weather or cold, he becomes nauseated and vomits, and is then all right again, but that if he overeats of starches and sugars, he may feel bloated, get a stomach ache, etc., but he will not be nauseated, or at least not easily. I also reasoned that in the beginning of the pemmican regimen I would not have the juices inside me to take care of an all-meat diet, and that what would amount to overeating during the first days might actually be undereating later on. I therefore made it a rule to trust my own appetites rather than the nutritionist's rules, and to eat only when hungry and as long as hungry. The first 3 or 4 days I ate almost every hour, nibbling just a little. I became nauseated only once, and that was when I forced myself to eat more than my appetite called for, just as a test. During that period, I several times started eating with gusto, only to find, after a few bites, that the pemmican was extremely distasteful. By merely interpreting that distastefulness as nature's warning that I'd had enough for the time being, I ate with gusto again the next hour. During the first 5 days, I ate about half a pound or less per day. By then, I was on an even keel, where I ate about 3/4 of a pound per day, and ate at regular meal times only. In other words, the nutritionists had been perfectly right when they had explained to me that the Eskimos can assimilate an all-meat diet perfectly because they have been conditioned to it. They were wrong in claiming that such conditioning takes centuries. It actually takes about 5 days. 3/4 of a pound per day was my normal consumption, almost without variation, while I was doing office work. But when I went to the country on weekends and indulged in rather heavy physical exercise, my consumption immediately went up to about 9/10 of a pound per day. It never did exceed 1 pound of the fat pemmican, as against the unsatisfactory lean. Water. In the beginning, I drank rather large quantities of water, not necessarily because I was thirsty, but primarily because I was not used to the lack of bulk, and felt rather empty. As I approached the point where the lack of bulk no longer bothered me, I drank less and less water, and surprised myself at the small quantities consumed. That I drank less during the second half of the period than during the first was no doubt in part because of my initial prejudice against fat, and because of the other circumstances which made me use the lean pemmican, type C, in the early part of the test. For I have no reason to doubt those who say that a high protein intake requires a large water consumption. It was when I was getting the highest percentage of my calories from fat that I drank the least. It is this which makes me suggest that a high-fat pemmican, type A or fatter, would likely prove an excellent life raft or desert survival ration. Those are, I think, the main points about my experiences to be brought out in a letter of this kind. I might add that, except during the 1 week of repairing the damage done by vitamin deficiency, I never once had a craving for anything but pemmican. In fact, I attended several dinner parties during the 9 weeks, and was perfectly content to eat my pemmican while the rest ate their roasts and vegetables. It is now about 6 months since I returned to a mixed diet. I am in perfect health, as attested by 2 medical examinations, but have changed my food habits to the extent that I now eat all the fat I can get hold of, where previously I had usually cut the fats from my meat and left them on the plate. In fact, there are times now when I have a real craving for fat, and a longing to return to the pemmican regimen. I know this: as soon as wartime restrictions are lifted on meats and such animal products as cheeses, my diet is undoubtedly going to consist very largely of such foods. And if I ever return to the Amazon basin, I will never again differentiate between my meals and those of my Indians on the ground that the latter are too fat. End of letter. In a discussion of pemmican hereafter, I quote Admiral Sir Leopold McClintock to the effect that he paid no attention to the prohibitions of a dietetic theory which happened to be in vogue among the doctors in a given year, if he knew that the food condemned by the theory had been found wholesome and in other ways desirable by large numbers of people through long periods. He said he always preferred experience to theory, if the two were in conflict. Perhaps, in giving adherence to McClintock's rule, I may suggest a corollary. It is that when a precept of the nutritionists, like the one against fat in warm weather, is in conflict with the tastes and practices of many people in many countries through many centuries, then it is likely the nutritionists themselves will eventually learn, probably through animal experimentation, or by deduction from some recently announced or recently noticed chemical fact, that the opposite of the previously held theory is true. So one may reasonably expect, within not too many years, that the dietitians will announce they have discovered Jehovah was right for Palestine, Achilles for Greece, the Australian black and the Amazonian red man for the humid tropics, in liking meat in those climates, and in liking it fat. End of chapter 6. Next, chapter 7, the blackleg in Shakespeare's time. Blackleg is another word for scurvy, which is an interesting topic. Catch you on the next chapter.